The Chicago Bar Association was created back in 1874 as just a general resource to help attorneys network with each other and be successful in their practices. The CBA chose to set up the insurance subsidiary because a lot of the members were asking questions about what types of insurance they should tap into. Who's the best resource for legal malpractice insurance, life insurance, health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And rather than sending those elsewhere, we figured we'd be a better resource if we just kept it all in-house and they had a familiar face to work with on a regular basis. And we think that it's very important to get the word out and let our members know that we're around to help as a resource. On top of that, we can work with any law firm or any attorney in the United States. When a law firm comes to us for a second opinion on their legal malpractice insurance policy, we're usually able to find them a lower price for the same coverage or better coverage, or in some instances, actually both. We can find a lower price for better coverage, which is obviously the end goal. Insurance is something that not a lot of people know the ins and outs of it, and maybe a smaller firm or a solo attorney needs that consultant to really keep them in line or to provide information to take it off of their plate. They have enough going on dealing with clients, collecting bills, doing everything that makes them successful in their profession. What I'm here to do is to be a resource and really to just provide assistance in something that they are not inherently an expert in.
I have the privilege today of introducing to all of you a Chicago legend, a national legend, Mr. Newton Menow. Mr. Minow is currently senior counsel at the Chicago office of Sidley and Austin, and he is the Walter Annenberg Professor Emeritus at Chicago-based Northwestern University. After serving in World War II, Mr. Minow completed his law degree at Northwestern University, and after that, he worked as a clerk for then-sitting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Fred Vinson. After that, Mr. Minow also served as assistant counsel to the Illinois Governor, Adlai Stevenson. Mr. Minow also has worked on the presidential campaigns of both Adlai Stevenson and President John F. Kennedy. In 1961, at the age of 35, Mr. Minow was appointed by President Kennedy as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, a position that he held and made changes in our country's landscape in ways that we'll talk about during the course of this interview. Mr. Minow also authored 4 books and numerous articles. He's the recipient of 12 honorary degrees and several awards, including the Chicago Bar Association's John Paul Stevens Award. So, Mr. Minow, welcome to our show. Thank you so much for being here.
Bob, I'm honored to be here with you.
Well, you're very kind to say that. You know, when I was trying to prepare for this interview, I couldn't help but think about where do you start with a fellow like you? And I'll tell you what comes to mind, a fact that I haven't read anywhere, but I know something about because you shared it with me. You had something to do with President Obama getting hitched to the First Lady. Could you tell us about that?
Whenever I see President Obama, and I saw him actually last Friday, he always says the same thing to me. He says, "Thank you for introducing me to Michelle." And I said, "I didn't introduce you to Michelle." He says, "Yeah, but if I hadn't come to your firm, I wouldn't have met her." I said, "Well, that part of it is true." What happened is that I have a daughter who was President Obama's teacher at Harvard Law School. And she called me one day, my daughter Martha, and she said, "I know your firm doesn't hire first-year summer interns, but I've got one student here who is so exceptional, I think you ought to take a look at him." I said, "What's his name?" She said, "Barack Obama." I said, "You better spell that for me." So she spelled, and I called our partner in charge of hiring, John Levy, and I told him, and he started to laugh. I said, "Why are you laughing?" He said, "Newt," he said, "we've hired him already." He said, "We've heard about him. Before you ever called, he's hired." We came to the firm, and we always assign a lawyer to be a supervisor, and we assigned Michelle Robinson to be Barack's supervisor. That's how they met.
There you go. Well, thank you for that. You know, Newt, you've had such a remarkable career, and so much of it is based upon television and everything that you did with the Federal Communications Commission. What in your mind, I'm going to be jumping around a lot, but what in your mind is the single most important accomplishment of the FCC under your leadership?
I believe we expanded choice for the American viewer. When I went to the FCC, there was no public television. There was very little cable vision. There was no satellite vision. There was no public radio. It was a very limited choice. There were only 2.5 television networks. Many cities had only 1 or 2 television stations. Homes usually had 1 television set. The whole family gathered around to see 1 program at one time. It was a different world. And I believed that we had to expand the range of choice, and we did.
Let me take you back to the time when you were with President Kennedy. What was he like in terms of his openness to your vision of communications and the future of television in our nation?
Well, President Kennedy was very sophisticated about television. He knew that he would never have become president if it weren't for television. He knew that his debates with then Vice President Nixon were largely responsible for him becoming president, so he was very sophisticated. I would hear from him occasionally about something on television. He was keenly aware of its importance. He invited me to go with him on a tour of the space agencies, and that turned out to be very important because of communication satellites.
Right. I'll get to those. Let's stick with the presidential debates for a moment. You hold the view, I believe, that the presidential debates, both at the time of President Kennedy versus Vice President Nixon, and going forward even until today, really changed the landscape of voter thinking across the country. Is that right?
I do. I think most people make up their mind about who they want to support before they see the debates. But I think there's a certain percentage of viewers who are affected to the point of changing their mind or being energized to vote. So I think they're exceedingly important.
Right. You know, when we talk about television, and maybe even before we started today, we were talking a little bit about, at least as a citizen, it strikes me that TV commentators all the time, they applaud failure and ignore success. And there's a lot of rancor that goes on. How did you and your colleagues at the FCC address any of those things and the balancing of their right to do that with the First Amendment but also knowing that it impacts opinion in a way that maybe is a little tilted?
Years ago, there was a doctrine that the FCC followed called the Fairness Doctrine, which basically said broadcasters should deal with controversial issues, but when they do, they should present all sides. That today is no longer the policy because it intrudes really on the First Amendment. So we really trust our broadcasters to provide all sides. Today, what we've got are certain channels reflect the Fox channel reflects a conservative point of view. MSNBC reflects a liberal point of view. Today, because there's so many channels, it's a different system. I think there's a lot to be said for having more voices, but also I think it's very important that our country get all sides of the issues.
Right. You know, when you were talking, I couldn't help but think about an initiative of the Chicago Bar Association to expand civics education in our elementary and secondary schools. Where in your mind do civics fit into the broadcasting realm? Anywhere at all?
Well, I think one of the most important things that you were doing as president of the Chicago Bar is getting lawyers more involved in teaching our students about civics. When I was a kid and went to public school, civics was a required course in school. It should be a required course in school, because if you don't understand civics, which means understanding the democratic process, understanding how laws are made, how laws are enforced, you really can't function as a citizen, as a responsible citizen. So I think it's essential that the lawyers and that the bar and that the judges do everything they can to teach young people, in fact, everybody in our society, about civics, because that's their civic responsibility.
You know, hopefully we're going to be doing some programming on civics, and it's a separate standalone topic, and when we get to it, I'm going to lean on you again and ask you if you'd come back and talk to us a bit more with a larger group.
Well, I'll be glad to, but I congratulate you for leading the Bar Association in that direction. It's needed.
Well, it's an important issue for all of us as Americans. You mentioned, you know, the First Amendment. The First Amendment wouldn't have gotten the recognition that it does were it not for what the FCC did and does, I think. Is that right?
I think you're right. I told the president, the FCC is the only federal agency that deals with a medium of communication.
Right. You mentioned with President Kennedy that you visited the space facilities, space administration facilities, and I think you and he had a bit of an exchange about the importance of satellites.
When I went to the FCC, and I'm not a technologically adept person, but one of these senior commissioners came in to see me today and said, "Do you know what a communication satellite is?" And I said, "No." He groaned. He said, "I was afraid of that." He said, "I've been trying to get people here interested before you came, and I hope I can get you interested because this is important." I said, "Well, educate me so I'll understand it." So I made a point of studying, and at that time, the Russians were far ahead of the United States in space. They had sent a man into space, we hadn't. But he convinced me that the one area where we were ahead of the Russians was in communication satellites. And communication satellites enabled us to transmit voice, pictures, whatever, across the oceans, across the continent. So I knew it was important, and when President Kennedy invited me to go with him to visit the space installations, he called me over one day and he said, "Why do you keep pushing this communication satellite? What's so important?" And I said, "Mr. President, sending a communication satellite into space is more important than sending a man into space." He said, "Why is that?" I said, "Communication satellites will send ideas into space. Ideas last longer than people." And I think today we see what's going on all over the world. We see what's going on in our country. It's all because of communication satellites.
Right. Going back to that era, did you see a future that had 340 channels on Comcast or what have you, DirecTV, for UHF, VHF, all the things going on? Were you able to see that?
No, I knew that through cable we could greatly expand the choices, but I had no conception that how far it would explode. And we're not done yet.
Well, and that's what I was going to, is that now that you live this so much, where do you see the internet taking us? Where do you see communications going? We'd like to know.
I think the internet is probably the most important invention since television. I think the internet has enabled all of us to communicate in ways that none of us ever dreamed about. Today, we just commemorated 9/11.
Right.
It's only 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there was no YouTube video. 10 years ago, there was no Facebook. 10 years ago, there was no Twitter or tweeting. None of this has happened so fast and so transformative that I think all of us are just rushing to catch up and understand it.
Sure. And do you sit back and just say to yourself, my gosh, where's this going to be in another 10 years or 20 years?
I do, and I think that every day. I see with my grandchildren, they don't even have television sets. They watch television through their computer. They prefer to communicate with you by the internet rather than by the telephone. So it's a revolutionary, massive change. You and I are lawyers. We're now communicating through the internet, through emails, in ways none of us could have possibly conceived of only 10 years ago.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
It is.
How do you like our new mayor?
I like him very much. I've known him a long time.
Have you?
Yes, and he's very interested. He's very interested in public television.
Yes, he is. Well, he's a big supporter of public television.
Right.
You know, public television's in trouble. Well,
Public television is in serious trouble. It's in serious financial trouble. When public television, I've been involved in it from the beginning. I was privileged to be the chairman of PBS years ago. Public television has never been financed properly in our country. Unlike, let's take two countries. Let's take Japan and the United Kingdom. There, everybody, in order to have a television set, has to pay a license fee, and that goes to provide a public television service, the BBC in England, NHK in Japan. We've never done that here. And as a result, it relies mostly on contributions and philanthropy. There's a minor federal funding, but it's a small part of what's needed. We really, the marketplace does not provide certain things. The marketplace does not provide great children's programs like Sesame Street.
Right.
The marketplace does not provide great programs like Ken Burns' series on the Civil War. And because of that, we've got to find a way to better fund public broadcasting.
Sure. And what's the role of government in that? I mean, you say it's public. I mean, why aren't we funding? Why isn't government funding that?
Public television really took off during the administration of President Johnson. The Vietnam War was on. The proposals for public television all involved some form of funding. There was one specific proposal that every time a television set was sold, there would be a $5 fee that would go into a fund for public television. President Johnson didn't want to increase any fees or taxes because of the war, so it never happened.
All right. You mentioned the series on for Ken Burns. I think there's a new one of his coming out.
There's a new one coming out. Ken was in Chicago this week. I saw him. It's a new one about prohibition.
All right.
And I heard him talk, and I learned so much that I never knew.
Sure.
I think the whole country will learn a lot.
Sure. Now, that was during the Depression era. You grew up in the Depression era.
I did. I was born in 1926. Calvin Coolidge was president. I'm still around. And I grew up during the Depression and still have a Depression attitude about things.
And that's not a bad thing to have a Depression attitude about things. Well, what do you think is encompassed in that in terms of fiscal responsibility?
Well, I think there's several things. One is the role of government, and that's where we're having this big debate right now in our country.
Right.
Should the government help people who can't get jobs? Should the government help people get medical care, which they can't otherwise afford? Should the government help education, or should it not? And there's a big debate in our country about the role of government. And my own sense is that somewhere in the center is the correct view. We don't want the government doing anything, but we don't want the government doing nothing. The government, without law, without government, you can't have law.
Sure. You worked with President Kennedy. What other presidents since President Kennedy have you done work with?
I was appointed by President George H.W. Bush to a commission right after the Iraq War, first Iraq War ended. There was a big argument about whether women should serve in military combat.
Right.
There were big divisions
big fights
of opinion.
about that, right.
And President Bush appointed a bipartisan commission, which I served,
Right.
on that question. And again, you had the wild extremes. You had some people who said women should be in the infantry on the front line. Some women said women shouldn't be in the military at all. We carved a middle course, I think, which exists today. So I've served President Bush. I served President Clinton on again, a bipartisan commission dealing with digital television. I've served the Department of Defense after 9/11 during the second President Bush administration. And I feel, because of my role in the presidential debates, I can't be partisan. I try to be either bipartisan or nonpartisan.
Sure. Tell us when you, well, here, first off, tell us what role you had with the presidential debates. I know that, but I don't know that our viewers do.
Well, let's go back to 1960.
Right.
There were no such things as presidential debates.
Right.
I had urged Adlai Stevenson, when he ran for president in 1956, to try to have debates with President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower had recovered from heart attacks. I thought it was unnecessary for President Eisenhower to run all over the country in a campaign, and but Adlai didn't want to do it, so it never happened. But in 1960, Adlai Stevenson wrote a magazine article that proposed presidential debates, and Congress got interested.
Right.
And Adlai was called to testify in the Senate. I worked with him on his testimony. And the problem was the law. There was a law, the equal time law, said that when a broadcaster gave or sold time to one candidate, must do the same for all candidates. Well, there are 243 candidates for president. 243. You can't have a debate with 243 candidates. So there had to be some judgment about which candidates had a chance to win and which. And so we went to Congress and made some proposals. Congress exempted the 1960 presidential election from the equal time law.
Okay.
One time only, 1960, only for president. That led to the Kennedy-Nixon debates.
Wow. Did you attend those?
No, the first one was in Chicago, and I happened to be in California, and there were no VCRs, there were no recordings, so I left a very important meeting with a client because I was going to see it. There were no debates between 1960 and 1976.
Why?
Because the candidates didn't want it and Congress didn't change the law. 1976, the FCC, and I was involved with this, changed its interpretation and said that news events were exempt and a debate should be treated as a news event.
Okay.
That was taken to court and we won.
Right.
But that led to the debates. And the League of Women Voters asked me to organize them. So I became co-chair. And I called a friend of mine, Dean Birch, who had succeeded me later as chairman of the FCC. He was in the Ford White House.
Right.
I called him and I said, would President Ford participate in the debates? He said, I'll call you back. Call me back. He said, President Ford wants to debate. I said, would you tell me why? This is the first time we'd ever have a sitting president participate. He said, Newt, if you're 36 points behind in the polls, what the hell else are you going to do?
Hello, I'm Lori Lightfoot, a litigation partner in the Chicago office of Mayor Brown. My message is directed to all lawyers engaged in private practice, government or corporate practice in Chicago and Cook County. Today, our justice system is facing unprecedented challenges that involve a myriad of issues such as funding for our civil and criminal courts, access to justice, mental health services, community service initiatives to help stem the violence that is plaguing our society, and much more. I am proud to say that the Chicago Bar Association, of which I am a member, is effectively working to address these and virtually all of the critical issues impacting the administration of justice. The association's long and distinguished record of service to Chicago's legal profession and to our community is second to none. Now more than ever, the Chicago Bar Association needs the support of our entire legal profession. Your CBA membership is essential, and your participation in the association's many professional and community service initiatives is welcome. If you're already a member of the CBA, thank you. If not, I encourage you and your colleagues to join the CBA. Now more than ever, we need your support. Join the CBA by visiting the association's website, chicagobar.org, or call our executive director, Terry Murphy, at 312-554-2002. And thank you.
When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.
Do you or someone you know owe your boss or recruiter money? Is someone forcing, tricking, or coercing you or someone you know to work or to engage in sex acts in exchange for favors or money? Has your boss threatened to hurt you, deport you, or someone you know, or hurt someone else if you leave your job? Is someone holding your passport or ID cards? If so, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline for help at 1-888-3737-888. Calls are confidential and interpreters are available.
This announcement has been brought to you by the Young Lawyers section of the Chicago Bar Association and the Cook County Human Trafficking Task Force.
I believe that part of the role of being a citizen in a free country is that every one of us must contribute somehow to the public service.